So, Joe, The Trouble with Being Born, what did you think?
Well, a very disturbing and quite unpleasant film, I found. I thought it was very well done, and I enjoyed it. For whatever reason, I find this kind of unpleasant cinema strangely intoxicating, and I think this is a very strong example. But it is a really weird and I found really provocative and strange movie. It starts off with a scene that reminded me a bit of something like Under the Skin. That kind of, it's got this sort of indistinct static and these strange expressionistic shapes on the screen. And then the voice says in voiceover, I woke to the sound of crickets. And it gives this sense of like birth and creation, but of something being born like from somewhere, out of something. And it's a really arresting opening because the camera tracks through this forest with this voiceover. So you sort of assume that it's a POV shot. And then it comes out of the clearing and the camera finds the girl who is giving the POV. And in that moment, you realize that actually it's not a POV shot. And I had this strange sense of like disembodiment, that I thought I was embodied, if you like, in this POV and realized I wasn't. And that was kind of unnerving. And it gave the next shot, which is just a fairly mundane tracking shot of the father through the flat. It gave this weird sense of like, it's like it restored the kind of alien imposition of the camera, you know, and gave it its legitimate status as something really peculiar. And so I thought that was a really clever opening. I liked throughout that it's got its sort of sci-fi aesthetic is quite unusual in that it's quite it's a firmly realist aesthetic, and yet it sort of puts in these very domestic situations this really peculiar storyline, and that juxtaposition I found really uncanny and unnerving, and as well as a lot of other stuff in the film. And so really early on, so he looks out the window, he says, oh, and he runs out there and the girl's drowning in the pool, and you can't help but think of like, don't look now. And then he says, not again. And I knew nothing about the film, and I love the way we come at these films knowing nothing at all, and not knowing what is happening. You just get this like, what do you mean not again? And then you realize that she's a robot, right? And so I thought, okay, this is a film, I guess, about grief. So I'm guessing this is a father who's lost his daughter and is kind of trying to replace her with this robot. And in a way, it is a film about grief, but not entirely. And then as that half of the film goes on, you start to get I started to get the profoundly uneasy sense that this is not so much a father-daughter relationship as a relationship of lovers. And it's really disquieting. And it suggests that relationship through scenes that are subtle enough that the part of you that doesn't really want to think that that's what this is about can think that kind of, but you kind of know that's not what's going on here. And it's a clever balancing act. And I was sort of ambivalent about it because it's also quite cruel. It's quite a cruel place to leave the viewer because it's so uncomfortable. And I wasn't sure what it was getting at or whether I was kind of on board with it. It started to remind me of that film Michael about the paedophile that was just had a similarly sort of detached restraint, yet depicted just this awful subject matter, and sort of left me feeling like, why are you doing this to me? What's the point of this? And I started to feel something of that here, but it's got such an interesting aesthetic and feel to it. And it's got this peculiar poetry. So the robot throughout is remembering and rehearsing in voiceover the stories of the child's past, and keeps repeating certain sequences, and it gives the whole thing this sort of looping purgatorial feel that is really quite intoxicating. And so the film's elevated by a sense of very uneasy poetry that doesn't just make it feel like kind of an exploitative, unpleasant film for the sake of it. And then of course the narrative bifurcates and the robot ends up with this old woman. And I sort of lost track of what had happened, and perhaps we're not told what has happened, but somehow the robot changes its face and becomes the woman's dead brother, long dead brother. And that story too starts to sour. And that story as well becomes imbued with this weird, perverse kind of sexuality. It becomes a sort of weirdly sexualized story. And so I think what the film is really about, or what it felt like it was about to me, is not so much grief, though certainly that's where it starts, but it's almost like inhabiting the past in literal sense is an act of transgression or subversion that is unnatural. And because it's unnatural, this weird incestuous sexuality bursts through the surface in this taboo-like, strange kind of effluvium or whatever. It's like a byproduct of this act of transgression. And the film has this sort of atmosphere or like mood of like something rotting, like rotting fruit. You know, there's a fecundity to it that is unpleasant. And it ends in death with a really ugly scene, but again in a domestic setting that makes it somehow all the more ugly. I think it's altogether really tough and quite unpleasant, and it really got under my skin. But as I say, I like this kind of film, and I think it was really brilliantly well done. So a very original and arresting movie.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So I did know that this, I did read the movie introduction. You're right, really, that it's good just to watch it completely fresh. So I knew it was about artificial intelligence, and so I knew from the start that that's what we were going to see. And so before we had that interesting opening that you said, there was darkness, and there were a few kind of clicking robot type noises, and I thought that sounds a bit like Blade Runner. And I thought, oh, I hope this isn't just going to be, you know, we've had quite a few AI films now, and I thought, I hope this isn't going to be cliched. And one thing I definitely would say is that this film is not a cliche. It's totally original and unique. I really liked that opening shot and that kind of ambiguity about whether it was the camera or whether it was a person. And actually, I think that ambiguity persisted throughout the film because, you know, there is that time when we see the girl in the house, but we hear someone in the woods shouting, "Papa," you know, which is her. So I wondered if there were two versions of her. And it is also very confusing, the kind of two parts to the film, the fact that she's in these two different places. We kind of know how she gets from one to the other. But, you know, it's confusing where in time they're happening, because, you know, they talk about Belgrade and, you know, you wonder if that's in Belgrade. So you wonder if actually that's already happened when the father and daughter are talking. Or so I found all of that a little bit confusing, but I did like that. I found that very striking at the beginning, how you thought that was the robot. So I knew it was a robot. I thought that was the robot walking through the woods. And then we actually see the robot walking into the picture from the left. And that really kind of threw me off. And so I did like that. I think I think what you say about this film is quite generous. And I guess it's because you liked it. I really didn't like this film at all. When you describe it as rotting fruit, that is what this film feels like. It feels like you're watching rotting fruit, and there's no relief from that. And it just feels horrible and terrible. And, you know, not in the way, say, of a Lanthimos film. I mean, I know we've discussed that before about, you know, how cruel Lanthimos is to his characters in his films, but you know, there was something about this that was worse. It was actually, you know, a kind of horror film almost. I mean, in some ways it was, I agree that it was so well made because the this it was just very subtle how the nudity and the cuddling between father and daughter seemed okay, but then there were just little subtle things which started to make it feel very uncomfortable. And I think it was actually brilliantly made, brilliantly shot. The score is amazing because it all adds to the sense of horror and terror. But of course, then we have that scene where he kind of puts her up on a kitchen ledge and removes her tongue and removes her genitals. And you kind of realize that, you know, I don't know what he's doing there, whether he's cleaning them, or you kind of realize then that it is, at least I took that as, that this is actually overtly sexual, that he is acting out with this robot, you know, kind of having sex with his daughter. And, you know, obviously that's really unpleasant. I thought it kind of intrigued me the way the animals in this film seemed the most alive. I mean, I think we had a couple of cats and a dog, you know, and actually it was almost like they were the only entities in the film that had a soul, that had a consciousness. The father and the old woman, they just seemed soulless. They seemed to have no depth, no emotion. I mean, you mentioned purgatory. It's like this is a depiction of purgatory, the rotting fruit. You know, it's slow, and it really leaves you sitting in it. And because it is well made, it is watchable. You know, it never felt boring. But I really didn't want to be in the place where this film kept me. I just found it profoundly unpleasant, intriguing, because I think, you know, you started to kind of talk about some of the issues about memory and inhabiting the past. And I think there is really interesting subjects here. I think it is full of meaning, actually. But, you know, I just can't get over the horror of it. I wouldn't particularly recommend this film, because I think, why would you put yourself through that? But I didn't really have any feeling at the end that actually that was worth watching.
That's really interesting. The film it reminded me most of was High Life, the Claire Denis one. Did you see that?
Yes, we actually saw that together in London.
Oh, right, okay. The thing that struck me about High Life that I really liked about it was you had this suddenly terrifying sense that if you remove yourself entirely from all the context that gives any kind of weight and meaning to morality and sense and meaning and community, if you are entirely removed from that context, what else falls away? What remains? And I had that sense with this film that, you know, because reality as we know it doesn't exist in this film, if you can re-inhabit the past the way that these characters literally do, so what else starts to change and fall away? And I think that asks a profoundly disturbing question about human nature. I mean, I completely understand. You said, I think you put it really nicely, that you just didn't want to be in the place that this film had put you. And I sympathize. I just find that place actually, however unpleasant it is, strangely productive and rich. And you're right, that sort of air of like incipient corruption that just seeps through the whole film really is really potent. But yeah, I quite enjoyed it, actually. And I think it really does have a strange kind of poetry, the way they keep saying those stories in voiceover, and the way the boy's story starts to intermingle with the girl's story. There's this weird bleeding overlap and all that stuff that isn't explained. You're right, the daughter, Ellie, I'm pretty sure that's the older version of her, isn't it? Who sits on the swimming pool with him, the one that's apparently missing. I mean, there's all kinds of ambiguities that I don't think I missed them. I think they're just inexplicable you know.
I think it's deliberately ambiguous, and I do think you're right. I agree that there is some poetry in that, and the, you know, never being fully explicit, but giving you enough and a bit of repetition that it feels like there's something. I mean, I do quite like the way, you know, the old woman's telling her about the photos, and then she's absorbing from the photos, you know, from what the old woman has told her. She started absorbing that into her story, into what she's saying. And yeah, there is something. I mean, I think it's really well made and really well written, and, you know, really intriguing. But I guess it's, you know, you probably do like horror films more than me. I think it is really a horror film, this. And, you know, I don't like a horror film unless it's got some other element to it, unless it's got some kind of, not necessarily a happy ending, but some kind of relief from it. Whereas, you know, I think so maybe this just reflects our different taste, because I do think it's a really well made film. I couldn't criticize, and in fact, it's the fact that I do feel so horrified is a sign of success for I think that's what the filmmaker intended me to feel. So
yeah, I think you're right that yes, the film's intention is it's supposed to be really unpleasant and difficult to watch, isn't it?
yeah,
what you take from that is kind of each to their own, isn't it?
so it's 1 thumbs up, 1 thumbs down.
Yeah, I mean, I'd recommend it, but with hesitations and caveats. And
Yeah. Okay, what are we doing next?
Next, we have a film called Accidental Luxuriance of the Translucent Watery Rebus by Dalibor Barak.
Well, that one sounds interesting. I'm looking forward to that.